As you know, we have two more market structures to discuss. And allow me to once again remind you of the big picture. There are four different market structures, and so far we considered two of them which are on the opposite ends of this spectrum, so to say. One is perfect competition on one end, another one is monopoly. So just to remind you, in the perfect competition, there are many firms, therefore an individual firm has no pricing power. Whereas in monopoly, because there is one firm producing a unique product, that firm has a lot of pricing power. That pricing power is sometimes referred to as market power, even though this term is less intuitive. Also, in perfect competition, there is strong competition among firms, and in monopoly there is one firm, so really there is no competition. In the extreme case, there is no competition from any other firm, if we're really talking about pure monopoly. And finally, we can say that the market is very competitive on this end, and in monopoly it's the least competitive because there is no competition. We also sometimes refer to markets with few firms as concentrated markets. So that is the picture that we have discussed so far, and there are two more market structures that are in between of those two extreme cases. One is called monopolistic competition and another one is called oligopoly. And those two market structures, they account for the majority of markets, of industries, of businesses that we see around us. The purpose of today's lecture is to discuss the market structure called monopolistic competition. It is discussed in great detail in chapter 12 of the book. As you may recall from our last quiz, monopolistic competition is a market structure that is quite close to perfect competition. That is to say, it is very competitive. We use the market for used cars as an example. And as you recall, we agreed that in that market there is a large number of sellers, or in more general setting that will be firms, which are small. Then firms can freely enter and exit the market, and the information about prices and specifics of the product are easily available. However, there is one feature in which the used car market or any other market that falls under the definition of monopolistic competition is very different from perfect competition. It is that the product of different firms are different. Everyone knows that there are different kinds of used cars. They differ by the make, the year, the mileage, the number of doors, color, whatnot. The same goes for any other monopolistically competitive market. For example, if we think of restaurants are, fairly small firms. Anyone can open a restaurant pretty much. Information about prices and menus is easily available, but we do know that restaurants are different. In fact, as I'm going to argue on the next couple of slides, the firms intentionally make their goods different. So that's why usually we're using the word differentiated, implying that there is an intentional effort on the firm's part to make their goods different from each other. Because as you remember, economists were excited about perfect competition, but firms absolutely hated it, right? Because you have no control over what you can do to your prices. And there was no incentive to innovate because everyone would still think of your potatoes as just same potatoes as everyone else's. So I want to talk a little bit about what constitutes product differentiation. The means of making your product different from your competitor's product can be very, very different. And this attempt of making some kind of a list, I don't want you to think that this list is trying to be anywhere close to complete. This is more like an attempt to give you some examples in a more or less systematic way. So first of all, in some cases, it is obvious to everyone that products are different, right? Everyone can tell a two-door car from a four-door car. Everyone can tell a Ford from a Toyota. Everyone can tell the difference between Mexican food and Chinese food, and so on. So that alone makes products different, because if someone feels like having Mexican food for lunch, well, they'll go to one restaurant, and others will go to Chinese restaurant. Another way to differentiate your product is convince the consumer that it is different, whereas it may or may not be true. Is it true that if I drink Mountain Dew while jumping off the cliff, I will be safe? Is it true that if I drink Mountain Dew, I will be a better snowboarder? Well, maybe, maybe not, right? So advertising in general tries to convince us or create some positive image of a product that in the end makes us more interested in the product. Branding is also an example of that. Well, is it true that a logo embroidered of a guy playing polo, embroidered on a shirt, makes it a better shirt? Well, some people think yes, some people think no, but many people think of a shirt with a logo as a different from just a plain shirt. Once again, it's a step up from perfect competition where everything is the same potatoes or everything is the same soybeans. So in general, advertising has the goal of making consumers perceive a product as different from their competitors' products. There is a well-written section in the chapter devoted to advertising, so I don't want to in any way compete with it. Advertising has some good things and some not so good things about it. The main good thing about advertising is it's informative. It tells us about new products. How would I know about a wonderful new smartphone or a wonderful new toothpaste that does wonders if there were no advertising? But at the same time, as we all know, advertising costs the firms, and as a result, inevitably, that cost of advertising gets reflected in the price of products, which, of course, we are less happy about. Products may also differ in how they are delivered, in a sense, what services are accompanying a specific product. For example, while some restaurants give you free chips and salsa, some restaurants give you complimentary French fries or unlimited soda refills. Others do not. That is one of the aspects in which the restaurants are different. For some people, that may be enough reason to choose one restaurant over the other. When you would go for an oil change, well, some shops just do an oil change, and some will also rotate tires at the same time. And some will give you a 14-point check and replenish the fluids in your car. Yet another example is how do we buy, let's say, electronics. We can go to the Best Buy and get some help from an associate who would explain us how this product is superior to that product and ask us what we are looking for and make suggestions what to buy. Or we can go just on eBay. Well, we can also read reviews, but of course we won't get as good of a service if we are self-served on eBay. All right, moving on. Location, as simple as that, location is also a means of differentiation. Because let's say when I'm choosing what to do for lunch, well, the location of a restaurant matters, right? I may like a restaurant in Lawrence, but, I'm not going to drive to Lawrence for lunch. A restaurant close to campus has an advantage over a restaurant which is somewhere on Wanamaker Street. On the other hand, a banker who works on Wanamaker Street, well, would prefer a restaurant there rather than a restaurant somewhere here in Midtown. The same goes for grocery stores. Well, where do we buy groceries? Where do we buy gas? Well, later on in marketing classes, you will hear, location, location, location. And of course, a gas station that is in a very convenient spot for travelers would have an advantage over a gas station that is somewhere in the remote corner of a town. And that would make consumers prefer the first gas station over the second one. Also, different stores have different layout. And sometimes people are conservative in their habits and they prefer a store that they know to another store where they would have to search for bread and then for milk and then for soda and, spending 40 minutes on shopping, whereas in their familiar store, they would spend only 10 minutes. Website interface may be different, so we prefer to shop on one website over another website just because we're used to their interface and where to click and so on and so forth. We tend to flock to familiar restaurants because we know exactly what we are going to order. And so yes, as I said, with this list I could go on and on and on. So these are just some examples that make consumers see products as different ones. In order to understand why firms are making effort to differentiate their products, once again, let's use perfect competition as a reference point. In perfect competition, all the products, all the soybeans from different farmers were absolutely the same. Therefore, the only factor on which sellers can compete is price. That's a terrible situation to be in because that competition would drive the price lower and lower and lower. And remember, in the end, in perfect competition, no firm is getting any economic profit. In monopolistic competition, if firms differentiate their products and they're successful in making consumers believe that their products are different, are special, then such a firm will be able to establish a segment of consumers that are more loyal to their product and loyal to the extent that they're willing to pay a little bit of a price premium for a smile, for a cleaner establishment, for free chips and salsa, for a better location of a gas station, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, we can think of a firm that successfully differentiates their product as a tiny little monopolist. This is kind of comical, of course, to talk about the gas station, let's say at the corner of 17th Street and Topeka Boulevard, as a monopolist. How is it a monopolist? Well, it's the only gas station at that corner. But there is a grain of truth in that, because people who drive by that gas station, like I do, they see it as a convenient spot to fill their tanks of their car. So I rarely go searching for other gas stations 4 blocks away simply because this is so convenient. So in that sense, this gas station has a certain degree of market power, of pricing power. It can play with its price because it knows that unlike in perfect competition, it will not lose all of their customers at once if they are 1 cent above the market price. That is the most important benefit and the purpose of product differentiation. So put differently, differentiation makes the demand less elastic than in perfect competition. Remember, in perfect competition, it was perfectly elastic, horizontal. In this case, it's still elastic, it's still pretty flat, as you're about to see on the next slide, but it's downward sloping. There are still quite a few substitutes, so the firm doesn't have an unlimited pricing power, but it has some pricing power. Now remember how the profit maximization in perfect competition and in monopoly were different. Here we have a downward sloping demand curve, and the moment we have a downward sloping demand curve, the marginal revenue curve is not the same as the demand curve. You saw that in the monopoly topic and in the exercise that you did for your last homework assignment. This happens every time the demand curve is not horizontal. And since the demand curve is downward sloping, just like in the monopoly case, the profit maximization procedure would be similar to what we had in the monopoly case. So we see this graph, and I hope you recognize the marginal cost and the average total cost curves, and then the demand curve, which is labeled P because demand curve connects price to quantities, and then the marginal revenue C, which peeled off of the demand curve, and that happens, as I just said, every time the demand curve is downward sloping. How do we proceed? Step 1, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We find that point. That point tells us the optimal quantity to produce. Here it is. We'll denote it Q star. And then remember this formula for profit. Profit is per unit profit, here in the brackets, times the number of units. So we need to record the price and then the average total cost corresponding to this quantity, and then multiply it by quantity itself to get this profit. And I hope it is clear to you that since price is above the average total cost, we are dealing with a positive profit. As I said, this is no different from what we had in the case of monopoly, which I hope is still fresh in your mind. But the interesting question is, what will happen next? Remember, this is no longer monopoly. This is monopolistic competition. Small firms, free entry and exit. So if there is a positive economic profit and there are no barriers that prevent new firms from entering the same market, you know what will happen? The new firms will enter. And in that sense, the process of the long-run adjustment in monopolistic competition is no different from what we saw in perfect competition. As you can see, this market structure that we are talking about right now is kind of a mix. It borrows some features, some stories, short-run story from the monopoly case, but the long-run story is just like the perfect competition. So as the new firms are attracted to this market, what happens to the demand faced by an individual firm? If you have more competitors and those new competitors take away some of your former customers, then of course you have fewer customers to work with. And that is represented by a decrease in demand for your services. Not the demand in the entire market, but demand specifically for an individual firm's product. So decrease in demand, the demand curve shifts to the left, or we can also say it shifts down. How long does this process go? In this sense, it is very similar to the perfectly competitive case. The process of firms' entry will continue until this market is no longer attractive. And that will happen when each firm makes zero economic profit. So the demand curve will go down to right here. And that is the point where price equals to average total cost, and that means zero economic profit. So at this point, there will be no more entry or exit. Since there is no more entry or exit, this becomes the long-run equilibrium. If we let the firms themselves decide whether to enter or exit, well, this is where everything stops. So this is where everything remains in an equilibrium. There are a couple things that are worth noting about the parameters of this equilibrium. And perhaps it would be easier for you to follow this by looking at slide 302 on the next page in your notes, which has a larger version of this graph. So first of all, remember how in perfect competition we also had this long-run equilibrium because there was also entry and exit. And in the perfect competition, everything converged to a point where each firm was forced to produce at the minimum of the average total cost. In this case, however, because the demand curve is downward sloping, it will touch the average total cost not at the minimum point, but a little bit to the left of it. The difference is not that great, but there is a difference. So there is a slight production inefficiency in the case of monopolistic competition. Another point I want to make is, in this case, if we look at the welfare or wealth created by an individual firm, we will see that there is some deadweight loss. Because remember, ideally, from the allocation efficiency point of view. We have the maximum welfare created when the demand curve, which is also the marginal utility curve, and which here incidentally is labeled P, intersects the marginal cost. In this case, we stop a little bit to the left of that. So this yellow triangle represents the deadweight loss. So it's not huge, but it's important to notice that there is a deadweight loss. So monopolistic competition is not as efficient in both the production terms and allocation terms as perfect competition. So once we establish this fact, should we use it as an argument against monopolistic competition? I personally don't think so, because think about the two worlds. One is the perfect competition where everyone is producing identical products, and we are not just talking wheat or soybeans. We are talking everything. Can we organize each market as perfect competition? Well, that would mean we would all drive the same car, wear the same t-shirt, eat one kind of bread, and so on and so forth. That's kind of depressing, right? People like variety. And in monopolistic competition, there is a great variety of products, different kinds of food, different kinds of cars, different places to buy your groceries, to buy your gas, to go for coffee, and so on and so forth. This aspect, the greater variety of products, is not reflected in any of the graphs that we've been drawing. However, it is clear that this aspect of monopolistic competition creates an additional benefit for consumers. So if we were to decide which we prefer, monopolistic competition or perfect competition, I'd say that little bit of production inefficiency and a little bit of allocative inefficiency, represented by a small deadweight loss, is a small price to pay for the enjoyment that we get from having access to a variety of products. Well, this is where this lecture ends, and the rest of it we will do in class on Monday. Thanks.